I'm going to start recording. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so lucky here today to have the amazing Lila Darwish with us. I'll give her a full introduction in a minute. But I know that there's a lot of big feelings going on right now, and there's a lot that's up with people. And I thought it would be really nice if we could just take a moment to just feel our bodies. Just be wherever we are. Feel your back against the chair that you're in. Feel your weight of your body being down here, down on the earth. If you want, you can imagine, touch your feet to the earth, to the ground, and imagine that there are roots going down, connecting to a vast mycelial network. And if you want, you can close your eyes and let's just take 3 breaths together. All right. So whatever's going on for you, there's space for that, and there's room for that here. We're gonna go into a little bit of intense topics, bioremediation and environmental justice. It's not the lightest topic. And so if you need to just take space to just breathe or just be present, or if you have other things that are going on for you, or anxiety about coronavirus, whatever's up, that's totally allowed and is great. And I want to invite folks to use the chat box to just share what's up with you. And if there are things that come up for you in the material that you want to share about in the chat box, that's super great. And also, if you have questions, you can put them there, and we'll do kind of our same format that we've been doing, where you can put questions in there, and Taylor and I will try to answer them. And then Lila will have some pauses for questions. And I'll be the interrupter if needed, and I'll go boop. So if you hear me make that sound, that means I'm interrupting Lila. All right, welcome folks. I'm so glad to see we're getting more of our people here. So Lila Darwish has been an ally in this movement. She's been a huge inspiration to me personally in my work with all of this stuff. And it was kind of a game changer for me the first time I saw her speak about grassroots bioremediation, because it was always something I was interested in. And, you know, we had this radical mycology thing. And then when Lila came, it was like, oh, wow. There's a whole movement. There's all these people. Here's this person who's this incredible networker between all of these people doing different bioremediation projects in different places, and really gleaning the learnings from each of these experiences and putting them together. She literally wrote the book on earth repair, which is an incredible resource. I highly recommend checking it out. We are selling it as MycoRenewal. We'll give you a good deal on it. Let me know if you want one. It's called Earth Repair. And right now, maybe I'll let you share what you do for work now, which I think is interesting. I don't know. I think I'm sure you'll describe it better. So I'll give it away to the wonderful Lila Darwish.
Awesome. Do your little tech thing. Do I have to do anything?
You're good.
I'm good? Okay. Well, it's good to meet you all and get to spend the next few hours with everybody. And thank you for the lovely introduction, Maya. So a bit about me and kind of why I do teaching at all on remediation and environmental justice. I got into remediation from environmental justice. I got into it because I had been doing community organizing for about 10, 15 years on environmental justice struggles in Canada, predominantly, because that's where I'm from. And it was doing that work on environmental justice issues, working with communities that were fighting major energy projects, or who were dealing with the toxic legacies in the aftermath of those projects, or were dealing with oil spills and not getting any help with recovery or anything like that. It was working with those communities, and it kind of brought up this idea and this kind of need to not just be sounding the alarm about what was happening in terms of the injustice, but also trying to find ways to actually help heal the land. Because a lot of the communities I was working with were also communities that were very land-based, and the destruction of the land and the contamination of the land was not only kind of killing and really making people sick, but it was also destroying people's ability to carry out their lives and their culture. And so I think all of that just kind of really pushed me to kind of try to figure out what are some really accessible ways that people can do to kind of help regenerate, detoxify contaminated land. And is that a way to also be in solidarity with some of those struggles? So that's what I'm talking about that. And I did write a book on earth repair, which was a beautiful learning opportunity to connect with different remediators and different folks who are doing different things when it comes to kind of regenerative earth work. What I do now is a bit different. The last few years, I've been doing emergency management and disaster response and recovery work. And I actually work in New Orleans at the moment. So Maya mentioned coronavirus. That is my life at the moment. And if anybody has any questions about it, I'm having to do a lot of kind of working with our health department and outreach and stuff around that and trying to help people feel more calm about the whole situation. So we're not going to talk about that on this call, but that is what I do now. So I think I'm going to start this presentation. First of all, can people, maybe just in the chat box, I kind of want to know if everybody knows what environmental justice is. Because I don't want to speak down to people. Like, does anybody feel like they have experience, they kind of understand environmental justice, they've done any kind of work around that? If you guys just want to like quickly type that in so I have a good idea of who I'm with. People should be typing. Okay, so Sarah's new to the topic. Is it like restorative justice before the environment? Ellen, definitely working with farm workers regarding exposure to pesticides. That's a huge environmental justice piece. Okay. In the field. Wonderful. Okay. So it's kind of, people maybe heard the word before, some people not. We're going to talk about it briefly. Ariel worked with Greenpeace and has much to learn, as we all do. I don't know if that's everybody. First contact via, oh, interesting. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna kind of jump into it. And I think it's always a good refresher to kind of talk about it and situate it in the work. Because if you're talking about doing earth work, people are a part of that work and we don't want to reinforce systems of injustice. So now I just have to figure out how to share my screen. Which I'm gonna do. Did it work? Yeah? Yes? Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to be talking for the next little while on bioremediation, environmental justice. And it's an interesting presentation. I told Maya before we started that it jumps all over the place as the warning. So just be cool with it. Be cool with the chaos, which is a good skill in our world these days. I'm going to talk a bit about environmental justice and about why we do bioremediation work in the beginning. And I know that a lot of your classes up to this have really focused on kind of mycology and mycoremediation and mycorestoration. So I'm also going to introduce working with microbes and working with plants a little bit more, because I kind of feel like you got to be doing all of it. And different situations will call on you to work with different modalities. And you can be that expert in fungi, but you're going to want to cultivate relationships with people who can also, either within yourself or with others, who can kind of bring in these other kind of multi-trophic approaches to the work. So I'm going to talk a bit about those things. And then we're going to kind of finish things off talking about a few scenarios that I want to get some of your input on. And I'll also share some of the things that I've learned, in particular around certain things in responding to disasters or kind of long-standing contamination. And at any point, if you do have a question, put it in the chat box. I think Maya's only going to interrupt me if it's like a really pressing question, and hopefully other ones we'll just take at the end. Does that sound good? Okay. I feel like we're all on one Skype date. It's awkward. So starting off just general, you probably already know this, but when we're talking about bioremediation, to me, it's working with living systems to detoxify and regenerate contaminated environments. We're talking about working with microbes. We're talking about working with plants and with fungi, so microbial remediation, phytoremediation, and mycoremediation. And they all have different ways of either binding, extracting, or transforming different contaminants. And we're gonna go a bit deeper into some of those other ways in a bit. Now, I wanna kind of situate this in the context of doing justice work. And this is something that when I was writing my book, I kind of did a whole chapter on, but to me, you can't be really doing bioremediation and regenerative earth work if you aren't also thinking about justice and decolonization, because we have that ability in the work that we do to actually, bring back health and beauty to the relationships, and also recognize that we're dealing with toxic landscapes because of certain mentalities and certain behaviors and certain histories that produce those. And wherever land was destroyed, people's relationship and people's ability to be on that land was destroyed as well. And we live in, all over the world, and definitely in Turtle Island in North America, we kind of live on lands that are stolen lands, and that are lands that were taken very dishonorably and very violently from indigenous people, from, descendants from slavery, all these things. We have a pretty rough history, and that history often destroyed the land to destroy the people, and kind of also remove the people who are caring for the land from the land, and their ability to do that work. And so I really like to kind of try to bring that thought around decolonization to the work. And also when you go forward in the work and you're doing any kind of earth healing work, and you might be working with impacted communities, or, just communities that are on the kind of the front line of toxicity, you kind of want to do it in a way where you're not reinforcing that dynamic and continuing that modality. So it's just kind of something to think about. And so, as I say, the practice of remediation and regenerative earthwork, it doesn't only involve detoxifying and revitalizing the land and kind of breaking it down to like plants and mushrooms and microbes. It is about trying to deeply repair kind of the wounds that have come before that. And if you're doing both of those things, that's a pretty special practice. Now, environmental justice. So when I ask people, do they have experience with environmental justice? It's a huge kind of word topic, but to me, environmental justice is just that recognition that everybody, regardless of race, gender, class, ability, health, whatever, everybody should have the right to clean air, clean water, to health, to being able to access health, healthy food, healthy air. And we live within a system and a world where that is not the case, and where it is the case that communities of color, indigenous communities, lower income communities are often the sites of toxic industries. They're targeted for that. We tend to see more toxic energy projects. We tend to see more dumps happening in the backyard of those communities rather than in rich white communities. Also, those communities are often given lands that are toxic to begin with. And when there are disasters, when we do have oil spills, when we do have, chemical plant spills, all that kind of stuff, when we have those disasters, those are the very same communities, because of racial injustice and classism, that do not get the same access to resources or recovery or the same response. I've worked on oil spills over the last 10 years where I've seen the difference between an indigenous community getting response and recovery from an oil spill and what the government and what industry offers them versus what a rich white community gets, right? And some of the decisions that get made that will put people's health and environment into risk based on who that person is and what the demographic is. And so when we're talking environmental justice, we're talking about health justice, racial justice, food justice, people's ability to be well, and to live in a healthy landscape, and the fact that that's not kind of the common practice, and that there's a history of that, and there's also a current kind of marginalization that happens. And so that plays into the work, because when you're looking at contaminated environments and you're saying, hey, maybe I'm really passionate about bioremediation and mycoremediation and things like that, and wanting to be of service, it'll be interesting who you end up kind of engaging with and where you might find toxicity and what it kind of correlates to in terms of the communities that have to bear that toxic burden. So something to consider. Now, I already mentioned this, but one of the reasons, like, I got into bioremediation was environmental justice. It was also food justice. I was learning how to farm at the time and really wanting to farm everything I could in an urban context. And again, because we live in these environments in our cities and towns, where because of how we built things, because of the destructive industries that were there before, because of just people's broken relationship with the land, where we dump things and kind of did a lot, we have maybe areas we can grow food in, but they're not necessarily healthy. And there is an ability kind of working with bioremediation to try to heal those spaces and bring back kind of clean, healthy soil. And that kind of helps a lot of different people by making that a resource and accessible, making it something that people can actually grow food in an urban context. And even you look at people who are coming from other countries, other realities where they're used to growing their own food and then they can't in a city, right? Because there might be land, but it might not be clean land. Finding ways to bring that back is really important. And so, you know, and again, there's some cities in America where it's just a given that if you're trying to plant in that soil, you're going to have lead, you're going to have cadmium because of different industries that were happening at the time, or what we built our houses with, what we painted them with, all that. And so how do we heal the land around us so that we can have healthy food, we can have healthy medicine, and that's something that everybody can have, not just the people who can afford to go to Whole Foods. So food justice is quite big. I also, in that kind of umbrella of environmental justice and remediation and kind of situating the work, climate justice. This is something that, you know, we're all dealing with climate change and kind of seeing the effects of climate chaos. If you're in California, if you're anywhere on the West, the fires kind of intensifying the way they have. I'm down in Louisiana, and so we're seeing rising sea levels and increased storms and things like that. It's kind of everybody everywhere is seeing it in some way. And one of the things that I tend to think about with bioremediation, and again, whether you're working with fungi or plants, is responding to disasters and helping with recovery. And this is something that, whether the picture on the left is a picture of post-Hurricane Harvey, all the different chemical spills that happened in the Houston area because you had this massive storm and all the flooding. Same thing happened in Hurricane Katrina. Same thing happened in Hurricane Florence, but instead of it being chemical plants, it was hog shit. Like it's something that when we have disasters, there are secondary environmental disasters that also create health disasters that come after that and health impacts. And so there is a way that if people were to apply remediation and organize in a certain way, they could potentially help with the recovery of communities in this aspect. And it's not simple, and it's also, the timing is important, but you look at fires in California, we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but is there a way post-fire, when we're dealing with a lot of toxicity, if a fire goes through a town, and we're trying to keep that toxicity from migrating into rivers, or people want to be able to grow in the soil again, are there ways that we can use remediation to help with that? And what would that look like? So to me, disaster response and recovery in this day and age is very tied to climate justice, because it's one thing to try to stop, you know, fossil fuels and keep them in the ground. But if you're already living with some of the consequences, how are we helping people kind of get well and helping the land recover as well? So there's that. And then the very uplifting ecological disasters and oil spills and things like that that we see. And again, as bioremediators, an oil spill is huge. Same thing with a kind of a response to hurricanes and fires and things like that. That can be at a scale that is really hard to sometimes organize and scale up to. But there are a lot of ways to kind of engage with that. And oftentimes you see communities that are dealing with the after effects of a cleanup job that didn't go far enough, or that kind of went to a certain point and then stopped. And is there ways to then kind of apply mycology, apply phytoremediation and microbes to kind of moving that forward? So that's kind of the context it's all in. So to me, it's like, how do we root remediation and restoration and justice? And I don't know if that's questions you ask yourself as you're learning this, even if you're just wanting to focus on mycology, how are you going to take that work out into community in a way that is rooted in justice and in a very kind of like full healing capacity? And I had just a few kind of things to put out there. This is a much longer conversation, but I don't want to get stuck on it too much. But I think it's important that when we're thinking about doing this work, that we acknowledge and we recognize the colonial history and the toxic legacies of the lands that we live upon and that we work in. And it's like, get to know, I mean, you might already know this, but who are the indigenous peoples whose lands you're living on? What happened to those lands? What was there in some of the cities you live in? You know, where did all the streams go? What was buried? What was it before it became a concrete situation? Or, you know, this river before it was dammed, what did things look like? Like, try to connect with the stories of the place that you are in, and also understand your own story. Often as a settler on kind of stolen land, where do your people come from? You know, what is your relationship to the land? And how do you then act in solidarity with kind of what's around you? Also, if you're doing this work and you decide to engage in community, and also engage in communities that are not your community, in terms of offering support, are you respecting and are you honoring the leadership and the knowledge that are coming from those impacted communities? Because there is a way for people to get very excited about what they're learning. It's like, oh, it's so scientific, you know, and that's elevated in our world. But are we actually acknowledging and respecting traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous knowledge keepers? Are we listening to the different voices of people who might not have a certain kind of access to university courses or this class or whatever, but have the knowledge of living in a place and living through an experience of kind of contamination and toxicity and disaster and all those things? And we don't have to just respect and honor those voices. We have to lift them up and kind of hold them as equal. So that's to me really important. Are you in your work, are you finding ways to share power? Are you sharing skills? Are you sharing funding? And are you sharing resources? One of the biggest things that I found over the years, when I first wrote my book, I did a speaking tour after, where I would go talk in different communities about, you know, bioremediation and kind of do these trainings. And I did a few in communities right after oil spills. And what I always found, that people were very excited to learn about a thing, but they were overwhelmed because their reality was they were already in a state of crisis and struggling with a lot of things in terms of lack of resources and oppression and everything. And me just showing up and giving knowledge wasn't always helpful. But if I showed up with the actual resources to physically do the thing, or showed up with access to funding to help pay people and help kind of bring those things into creation, that would be different. And so in what ways are you kind of bringing those into a community and showing up with not just kind of like, hey, I know a thing, but the ability to do the thing, the ability to connect people, to get funding, to get resources to the front. So that's something to consider. Biggest thing I found with working with communities that are kind of either dealing with long-standing toxic issues, and this is everything from like your cancer alleys, the communities that are right around refineries. You know, it could be like farm workers, like Ellen is working with farm workers and pesticides. It could be in the aftermath of an oil spill or a fire or something like that. The biggest thing I found, and where I've seen people kind of fall down, is people like to give hope. And so they make big promises and they say, oh, we can heal this. You've got us to sprinkle some mycelium on it. We had a big mine disaster in Canada where people were sending messages to the impacted indigenous communities saying that they could deal with this mine disaster by seed bombing it with hemp, right? That's a no. That's a hard no, because it wasn't going to work because it was at the bottom of a lake. But B, it's an overpromise, it's oversimplification, it's false hope. And you don't want to give false hope to people when they're in a desperate place, because it's just not, it's not right. And so don't overpromise, don't give false hope. You know, be really clear about what you can offer and what kind of solution that you're talking about, what it can do, and also about the work that it requires and the time frame and everything, because that's how you build trust with people, and you don't want to lose trust. And that's the same thing with impacted communities as it is with elected officials or first responders. If you come in there promising big and in a way that isn't grounded, if they learn that that's not the case, they'll stop trusting you. You lose access. And you can't really do your work if you don't have access, if you don't have people behind you. So that's something to consider. Also, thinking like a healer. So coming into a situation and actually looking at it in a bigger way, you know, like you, again, might just want to look at a situation and say, I love doing mycoremediation and I want to make this a mushroom thing. Or you don't like that and you want to make it a plant thing, but it's less about what you want and more about what the situation needs, what the landscape needs, and actually coming in there with that openness of mind so that you're willing to kind of think outside the box, you know, think about your different tools and solutions and kind of meet the land where it's at and kind of figure out what sequence you're going to engage in terms of your remediation. By that same token, coming in as a healer, you know, coming in there and also understanding that, let's say you want to help a community because there's been an oil spill and you want to deal with some of the post kind of impacts. The time for that is not necessarily in the moment where the spill is happening and everyone is panicking. Same thing in a fire, right? Right in the aftermath, people are panicking, they're distressed, they've lost their home, there's a lot going on. And so meeting people where they're at with oil spills, sometimes the really important thing is actually getting information to people about the health impacts, the environmental impacts, what they can do to stay safe in an oil spill or a response, right? That can be the first step. And then kind of moving into the recovery piece comes a bit later. So kind of being open to that and thinking less about your ego and what you want to see happen and more about what kind of the speed at which people are moving and what the land needs, and being open-minded to that. Also, engage community wherever you can. Build partnerships, build relationships, let people know what you're doing, listen as much and if not more than you talk. Because you will find out a lot, even about the places that you're working with. You will find out so much about them if you listen to the people who live there. I was working on a project in Chicago and we didn't have a chance to do soil testing, but we were just talking to the neighbors around the site, and they were telling us everything about what they've seen dumped there, what used to be there, that the car was buried under that site. Like all that stuff comes from actually talking to people and bringing them into the process. And that gave us a lot of information about kind of what we had to work with in terms of contamination. It also is, again, if there's groups and other people in that setting, bring them in a really collaborative way, present, share your knowledge. Kind of if you have a certain idea of what you want to see happen, make that really apparent and kind of invite collaboration and creativity and synergy into that so that it's not just your thing, kind of make it bigger than that and respect what other people are doing and find ways to tie it in if they want to be involved, because people don't always want to be involved. So it's kind of navigating that. As I said, building relationships, really important, building it with local people, with local leadership, with first responders, politicians, all that in that thing will allow you access and allow you to do the work. And then sometimes there's also a need to repair relationships. If you're coming into an impacted community, if you're a white person coming into an indigenous community, coming into a community of color, you're not from there, you represent a certain thing and a certain privilege, and you have to kind of sometimes do some repair work for what that means to people and kind of build that trust and really show that you're there to kind of be accountable and to be kind of responsible and kind and not to steamroll folks and everything. So it's kind of both is needed. And we're not just repairing relationships with people, we're repairing relationships with the land, but the two go together. Now, I have this little point here about language check, and I'm not sure if you already talked about this in terms of some of the ways we talk about remediation. Colonization is in our language, it's in how we speak, it's in kind of how we do things. It's very deep. And one of the things I remember learning really early on when I was writing Earth Repair and doing work with interviewing different bioremediation folks was, especially in mycology, how much we use the word colonization in a good way. How we talk about how mycelium colonizes the substrate and how we want maximum colonization and all these things like that. And that's kind of how you read it in the textbooks, and it's how the academic folks will talk about it. But again, if you're talking about mycelium, you're talking about mycology with communities that the word colonization is equated with genocide, you might want to find a different word, right? Because then people see themselves not as like, this is not for me. They say, oh, this is like, if we're not using words that trigger people, and I would say the word colonization very much is a triggering word, it's like things like that, consider that, right? Like think about how you're speaking about a thing. And I bring this up because especially in mycology, that is like one of the big ones, So that is something. And finally, just on the rooting injustice, is the best medicine when it comes to any kind of dealing with contamination is making sure we never deal with it in the first place. And so there is that need to be in alignment with environmental justice struggles, to be in alignment with people who are trying to stop a pipeline before it's built, who are trying to stop a really destructive project or dump or something from happening. Because once those things happen, the cleanup work is so much harder than fighting it to not happen in the first place. And I think a lot of people on the front lines in the communities are trying to fight these projects, and we need to back them up. Because again, a lot easier to, I don't know if it's easier to stop a pipeline than it is to clean up an oil spill, but you can avoid a lot of distress and pain by making sure those things never happen in the first place. And a similar thing is looking at things like prescribed burns, like supporting communities who are trying to do that work. Because again, doing that preventative and preemptive work means that we are dealing with less of a disaster in the aftermath. So I never want to kind of say like remediation is this thing where we can now just clean everything up and we can just like throw all these solutions at something when we had the ability to avoid the problem in the first place. There are problems we can't avoid. We live in a toxic society. We live in toxic houses, and there's been this long standing legacy of just a lot of things kind of building up. But there are things that can be prevented, and there is strong work in kind of aligning yourselves with that. Is there any questions? Any need to boop?
I don't think so. But I did want to say, yeah, we talked about that language, and Willoughby mentioned that in his cultivation workshop. So we're using myceliation as opposed to colonization.
Good.
And then also we were talking about training fungi and like a good alternative for that, because you're not really training the fungi because they're doing their own thing. So I'm a big fan of just using acclimate, like supportive acclimatization.
Beautiful.
And we're playing with that language.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I mean, y'all getting that kind of information, and I'm happy, Willoughby, and you talked about that, because I would say 5 years ago, nobody was talking about that. Like no one was bringing that kind of attentiveness to the work. Predominantly because it was a very white-led kind of men teaching that kind of stuff, which means that they're not necessarily triggered by that the way other people might be triggered. I think the piece on even how we speak about fungi, how we speak about plants, like when we're working in allyship with, you know, mushrooms and plants and microbes, also getting out of that extractive mentality and that mentality of dominance. And actually courting them like they're allies, wooing them, like actually honoring the incredible work that they're doing that is actually beyond our capabilities in certain ways. And so I think it is beautiful to try to bring respect into the work, because part of colonization is that destruction of relationship with nature and also putting it below us instead of recognizing the beautiful brilliance in all these different beings. So I love that. That's great.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of just having your one mushroom species doing the work, you're having, you know, you're supporting the whole ecosystem. And
and I mean, that is a similar thing. And when you see people doing, when I used to teach people, and I would see people sometimes doing mycoremediation projects where they would, again, just like throw mycelium down and kind of be like, blam, I did it, you know? And that was a bit of the ego thing and that mentality of like, it's a quick solution and we just kind of like take it out of a bag and do a thing. And kind of considering this is a living being, how are you going to help it survive? You're putting it in environments that we don't necessarily want to live in. You're not giving it food. You're not giving it like shelter. You're not giving it those things it needs. And then you expect it to do the work for you. And if you come at it like a healer and you're like trying to take care of a being and also honor a being, you're trying to help it survive, because it can't do the job you're asking it to do in terms of remediation or restoration unless it's living and thriving. But also it's just a very disposable, very disrespectful way to treat any kind of living being. And so that kind of bringing that to the work is really important. I wanted to briefly mention, just as we kind of finish off on environmental justice, the work of, there's some really interesting folks who are doing work where they're kind of bringing environmental justice and bioremediation together. And one of the ones is a common friend of Maya and mine. Her name is Lexi Groper. You might have heard of her, you might already know her, but she is part of a project down in Ecuador that MycoRenewal was and is still involved in, called MycoRenewal. And this is a project that it's been in many years. Before it was MycoRenewal, it was, you know, MycoRenewal, it was the Amazon MycoRenewal project. It's been going on for a while, but it is kind of in response to major oil contamination that was left by Chevron Texaco in the Ecuadorian rainforest, where basically they just left pits of oil. And the indigenous communities in that area have some of the highest rates of cancer, birth defects, everything because of the oil contamination and the toxic contamination in their environment. And so many years ago, folks like Mia Rose Malta, you heard from, and others kind of came together and kind of engaged with the community in terms of trying to find bioremediation solutions to start breaking down some of that contamination, because the company wasn't doing it. And that's what we see a lot in terms of indigenous communities, where they're left with these toxic burdens and they can't get any support from the company or government in doing anything about that, because the company and the government doesn't value them and wants to kind of leave their shit somewhere. And so several kind of generations of remediation folks were kind of working on different projects. The most current one is MycoRenewal, and Lexi moved down to Ecuador and started working in that area and doing things around mycocultivation, working with some of the local groups, doing it in Spanish, and also doing a lot of work, not just in terms of cultivation and things, but education and training up women's cooperatives and local permaculturists in terms of different ways to do mycology, mycoremediation. Right now, she's teaching a class all on kind of remediation for local indigenous kind of land defenders and folks like that. And so to me, it's a really neat project because there's a lot of different kind of moving pieces to it, not just the remediation piece, but also that piece of trying to really respectfully be in the place that you are and really investing in sharing skills and resources with local community. And not only that, it's like she does her work, but she's also supporting, you know, the fight and the struggle for the folks to actually get justice and get kind of compensation or push the companies or whatnot. So if you have a chance, look up MycoRenewal. They're always looking for support and funding. And so if you have access to those things, definitely send those down. But they're doing great work. And they're also doing really interesting work at not just, again, looking at mushrooms and looking at mycoremediation, but also looking at microbes and how that can work when it comes to breaking down oil contamination. So lots of cool things there. That's just a few more pictures. That picture on the left is a picture of one of the oil pits that's been left behind. And these are kind of interesting pictures that Lexi sent me of the fungi that they find kind of growing in the oil. And they've been trying to work with local species to kind of be like, are there solutions that are growing here that can actually do some of this mycoremediation work? So lots of cool things happening down there. And then they're also working with how do you say, acclimatizing the mycelium, trying to find mycelium and kind of get it to work with the contamination that's there, as well as the microbial remediation of some of this oil contaminated soil and sludge. And that's the picture on the right. So lots of interesting stuff that's been started and kind of worked on over the years. And I think an interesting thing about that project is that project was kind of working in phases, but it really started taking off when Lexi kind of moved to Ecuador and kind of embedded and lived there. And I think that means like in a lot of projects we're doing, we tend to come in and out of them if they're not our home. And it's been a very different phase of it with having someone physically there in community doing the work. Now I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna make sure I have a time check. I wanna talk about bioremediation really fast in terms of microbes and plants. Because again, we could talk about environmental justice for a long time, but I wanna keep it moving. Just before we dip into that, I want to do a quick reality check. You might have already gotten this, but when we talk about bioremediation, one of the reasons why, again, that environmental justice piece, why we look at it is because it's cheaper than conventional remediation. And some of the tools to do it are more accessible to community versus like big tech, big equipment, big chemicals that are all like kind of living in this kind of industry, government, that kind of world. But on the other side of, you know, bioremediation, it's time and it's labor intensive. We have to think about certain considerations. For example, I'm sure Danielle brought this up with you guys in the last one when she was talking about toxicology, but the difference between chemicals and metals, right? How metals, you can't break them down. You have to find ways to either immobilize them or hyperaccumulate them. Chemicals can be broken down, but it's just like different contaminants equal different strategies that we're working with. No one size fits all when we're talking about bioremediation. So again, you can get really stoked about, I don't know, just wanting to work with sunflowers to deal with lead, or just wanting to work with, you know, doing a myco installation for something. But you have to look at your site. You have to look at what's going on, what the contamination is, also the community around it and what they're cool with. You have to kind of play with those different pieces. And that is something that, again, industry and lots of other folks, why this doesn't necessarily get taken in all the time is because those are hard pieces, or we have that thing where we want to mass produce solutions. And this isn't always a solution that can be mass produced, but it has complexity and it has beauty if you're willing to kind of dive in. I always like to kind of remember that, to me, the easiest thing to remediate is land. Then comes surface water and then groundwater. If you're starting to work with remediation of groundwater, you're getting into a thing where you're going to need more technology. You're going to need kind of some more equipment to do that. And it's a lot less accessible and more difficult to work with. Similar when we were talking earlier around rooting the work in justice, you want to do this work and try not to do harm. And there's the piece of harm that is about kind of, again, reinforcing certain oppressive dynamics in communities, losing credibility for the kind of work by doing it in a really shitty way, over promising. There's all those pieces. There's also the do no harm kind of aspect of, you know, if you're coming into a more wild environment and you're like, hey, I'm going to do myco or I'm going to do phytoremediation, and you somehow introduce a species that throws everything out of whack, or you introduce an invasive species, you will do more harm than good. And again, you have to think of it as a healer. If you're dealing with something that's very like broken down and struggling, and you introduce a very voracious thing into that environment, you're going to destroy the balance. And so sometimes people get very excited. They read about certain plants, remediators and mushrooms, but it's more, I feel like, a plant thing. They read about plants that are invasive species that are incredible remediators, and then they want to apply it because they're trying to find a way to make something that's hard on the landscape into something good. We all want to be little alchemists, and try to change like something into something bright and beautiful, but in a certain context, that's not a good idea. And so it's not necessarily always time to experiment when things are really struggling. And so I always kind of put that out there. Another aspect of doing no harm is also kind of safety considerations. And so if you're going in to do this work, if you're leading other people in doing this work, model the proper safety and health protocols in doing the work. So don't be kind of cowboying it up by being like, oh, there's lead there or oil, and I'm just going to wander around in my like shorts and flip flops and just show like I'm a badass. Wear protective gear, because if you're wearing it, other people wear it. If you're wearing a mask, a respirator, because there needs to be a respirator because of certain contaminants, it shows other people that there's a need for that. And it teaches them that they have to protect themselves as well. You don't want to kind of create another thing where people feel like they shouldn't protect themselves because you're playing it like it's not needed. And so that's something that's really important. It's really important to skill up in this work, because if you get the skills, then you can do the work and you can do it well. And also have that humility that you don't need to have every skill, but you need to know how to kind of know what you don't know and call in the people who have that skill and make that beautiful team of folks who have complementary differences. Now with this work, doing it of scale is a big thing. Like I think a lot of people have heard about bioremediation, they've heard about MycoRemediation, microrespiration, all that stuff, but we don't always see it being done on a huge scale. And so you got to skill up before you can scale up. But there is a need to try to bring it out into the world in a bigger way. There are some projects that have done that. There is some industry projects that have done that as well. But it's just something to consider. And again, don't be over-promising what you can do. Now, funding is a thing, making sure you have it to do the work. Some things don't require as much funding as others, but it is kind of, you need to be creative with that. In terms of soil testing, in terms of, if you're trying to put signs up, for example, to let people know that they shouldn't be eating your mushrooms that are growing in a contaminated environment, or they shouldn't be eating that plant, those things do cost money. There's creative ways around it, but it's something to think about. We'll talk about this later, but this point about needing to pre-position your resources for response. If you're trying to think about doing any kind of remediation in response to spills, in response to fires and things like that, you have to kind of have your stuff ready ahead of time, because otherwise you have this gap in terms of your ability to do the work. That could be 6 to 8 weeks long, because all of a sudden now you're trying to make a microfilter, right? And you might want to be able to get that out sooner. So, when we think about as organizers, how are we working with each other and with different kind of allies in the communities to actually have some of these things ready and on hand, because there's a chance it might be needed. So that's kind of my another kind of reality check before we kind of go into more things. Now I'm talking briefly about microbes. So microbial remediation, this is working with microbes. I know that often in MycoRemediation, there's a really good pairing of MycoRemediation and then microbial remediation, like breaking things down with mushrooms and then kind of doing some kind of application where you're bringing in microbes to kind of take it a bit farther and to break down other things. And there's different ways that can be done. There's very professional ways that can be done, where you're literally buying a bacterial inoculant that's been worked on in a lab that is very specific to certain contaminants, and that research has been done. The things that I tend to teach are more not those things, because again, when you're dealing with those really specific bacterial inoculants, you're dealing with patents and capitalism and people owning it. And it's not always accessible. So if you didn't have that access and you want to do this work yourself, we're going to talk a little bit about what that works. And for me, microbial remediation, really good when it comes to breaking down certain contaminants, especially polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, things like that. Also good for helping immobilize kind of heavy metal contamination. So like one or the other. When we're doing any kind of microbes, what we're trying to work with is we're trying to get as much diversity of microorganisms and quantity of microorganisms as we can into the mix. And so often, let's say if you're dealing with, I don't know, it's a contaminated lot in an urban area. Often ways things have been also contaminated, the land has also been destroyed, right? The soil has lost a lot of its ecology, its soil food web, it's lost a lot of those beneficial microbes. And so as a healer, you're trying to bring that back. Because what you're hoping for is not only just kind of like bringing back that diversity and that vitality to your kind of soil ecology and your soil system, but if there is contamination there, the more diversity and quantity of microbes that you bring in and that you introduce, the more chance one of them is actually going to want to break down what's there. And if you don't have that lab where you get to specialize on that, you just try to really just bring as many creatures to the party as you can. And so diversity, quantity, important. We also, whether we're working with kind of composting as a way to bring in all these different microorganisms, or working with something like actively aerated compost tea, which is another way to inoculate a site with beneficial microbes, we have to always think about temperature, oxygen, and food source. Because these are also things that will allow you to have that diversity and that quantity, and will also contribute to how quickly things can be broken down. So all important. Now, one of the easiest ways to bring microbes back into an environment is to learn how to make really incredible compost, which is not that hard a skill. And some people, I find people who are like dumpster bears and kind of like love to like bring lots of weird stuff to the party and kind of just gather lots of things, do really well at composting. But I mean, what you are trying to do is really make an amazing compost pile, a very active and a very alive one. So we won't go through it too much today, but really getting your thermophilic composting skills down. And thermophilic composting is one of the types of composting that's known for just building that diversity of microorganisms. And it's one where there's a lot of kind of work with temperature, having the right ingredients that you're kind of making in your compost pile, having your right kind of materials that have compost, that have carbon, your right ones that have nitrogen, layering them up, and then doing different things where it kind of makes the temperature kind of go up and come down over a certain amount of time. And that is what allows you to really not only inoculate a site with beneficial microbes, but also build up clean, healthy soil. And in certain environments, that is an actual strategy in terms of getting healthy soil on top. That becomes a bit of a barrier between the contamination that's below, while also inoculating it with these microbes that could potentially either immobilize or break down what you're dealing with. So that's a helpful thing. One kind of little trick of the trade is when you're also trying to stimulate bacterial growth, giving bacteria some of the things that they like to eat. One of those things being phosphorus. So if in conventional bioremediation, they literally will spray fertilizer on contamination. Not the best thing in some ways to do if you're thinking about other environmental issues. But the thing behind it is that they're bringing the food that will make these bacteria kind of multiply. And so when you're doing your composting and things like that, finding ways to put in ingredients that have phosphorus in it is just bringing more of that source of kind of activity and food into your environment to kind of create more of what you need and to support your microorganisms that you love. So even just kind of thinking about, do you have access to chicken manure? Do you have access to buckwheat, to certain things like fern and sorrel and dock, fish bones, fish meal? All these things have kind of higher levels of phosphorus. Another really interesting thing about bringing phosphorus into compost is that they have found that phosphorus can immobilize certain metals. So if you are trying to do this work, let's say lead is a big issue on the site that you're working with, and that's a huge issue in most of our urban areas, especially if people want to garden, farm, and things like that, predominantly because of lead-based paint and leaded gasoline from the 70s. If you're trying to kind of deal with lead, they've actually found that amendments of phosphorus in things like fish bones and things like that can actually immobilize the lead by kind of creating a different thing out of it. You can't break down lead, but you can shift it in a way that it becomes something called lead pyromorphite. It combines with the phosphorus and it makes it less bioavailable to kind of move into things, right? And so that's just, again, you're kind of stacking your functions with that. So something to consider. Now, another way to kind of bring beneficial microbes into kind of your healing process is working with actively aerated compost tea. In kind of the Amisacho picture I showed you, there was like a big kind of micro brewer, and that's a way that people can do this at a bigger scale. But if you're working at a smaller scale, people might have heard about compost tea before. There's something with compost tea where a lot of people do it, but they don't do it well. And so they make this beautiful bubbly brown soup, and it smells earthy, and they think they've made some magic concoction that brings life to the land. And actually it's just like really beautiful molasses water with some dirt in it. And so if you want to do this in a way that you're actually doing bioremediation, and again, we're dealing with contaminated land, so you have to step your game up. It has to, like, you're trying to go with as much microbes, as much diversity as you can. You want to do this well. And so in order to do this, you're basically, with this, you're taking a bit of compost that's really good compost, as well as worm castings. And we'll talk about that in a second. And you're brewing it up in water with certain food sources for your bacteria, because you're trying to kind of amplify what's there and then be able to apply it more in kind of a spray way. And that is also really helpful when people are, let's say they're trying to break something down mycologically, and then they can actually spray this on top of it at a certain point. Or if you're trying to even break down your compost more, because maybe you're trying to compost contamination, you can use your actively aerated compost tea to be this other source of constantly re-inoculating and bringing more microbes who can potentially break down your contamination, or help kind of bind things. So it's a really good way to do that, but you got to do it right. And one thing about this is, I have this on my website in terms of like what you do for it, and I think it's very common knowledge, but you have to have the right kind of brewer, the right kind of bubbling device to kind of give the oxygen you need, and the right food source. And then you have to apply it quite quickly when it's done. So these are all things to consider. And you can't amplify your biology and your microbes in this if you don't actually put in compost that has aerobic microorganisms, right? If you have compost that's kind of fermented and kind of didn't have a lot of oxygen, you're going to have anaerobic, like bacteria that don't necessarily do what you want to do. We often find the aerobic bacteria are the ones that do the best work with hydrocarbons and things like that. So you need to have the right kind of inoculant source. Why you often hear people talk about using worm castings in both their compost and in their compost tea is that worm castings, or worm poo, they've actually found it to have a bacteria within the castings that is called Pseudomonas florensis, and it is known and tested to actually be a bacteria that breaks down hydrocarbons. So if you don't have a lab, and that's like your only way to be like, hey, I have hydrocarbons in the soil, but if I put this bacteria into the mix and try to amplify and give it room to grow and to multiply, you are kind of bringing in one of the beings that could potentially deal with what you have to do. So good thing to think about. I mentioned this quickly. There is the potential, depending on what kind of contamination you have, to compost it. And so this is kind of not only trying to break it down using heat and things like that, but also that bacteria. So what you do in a situation like this is you take contaminated soil. This is, to me, quite specific to chemicals and hydrocarbons especially. But you take, bits of your contaminated soil and you layer it into a compost, and then you try to get it into that thermophilic compost, that hot compost cycle. And also you're constantly re-inoculating it with your compost tea that hopefully has some of those microorganisms like we talked about that can help break down things like hydrocarbons. If you're doing something like this, and this has been done with dealing with oil contamination, if you're doing something like this, you have to be very careful about the fumes that are coming off it, which is why you want to wear protective gear in certain cases. And you want to make sure you're not doing this upwind of a school or anything like that. So it's something that you have to have more attention towards, but it is something that has been done, and they've had some really good results in breaking oil contaminated soil down doing this. So something to consider. Am I going too fast, Maya? We good?
I think you're doing great. The Pseudomonas, you're talking about what's used in the iOS 500. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's one of the things used in the iOS. Yeah, it's just a common.
Yeah. But is that Pseudomonas fluorescens? Is that the species?
Yes.
Okay.
Did I say it wrong?
No, I think you did. There was a question about the species name.
Yes, that is the species. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Whoever smart person asked that question, they're smart.
Smart people here.
Fluoresce?
Say what?
Does that species fluoresce?
No, that's a question I don't know the answer to. You should Google that. Whoever discovered it maybe was having a special moment where they thought it was fluorescing. I'm not sure. But it's a beautiful name for a bacteria. Also, I want to say, you meet people, so y'all love mushrooms. That's why you're in this course. And you meet mycology people where they're just like so passionate about fungi. It's rare that you meet people who are really juiced up about bacteria. And that's sad because bacteria are amazing. And when you do meet the people who are really juiced up about bacteria, it's a bit awkward because it's like hard to join them in their passion because it's something you can't even see sometimes. But I have found, and I've seen this with folks I know who do oil spill remediation, the use of microbes has been something that they have found to be very effective and a lot more applicable in a wide scale of kind of landscapes and environments. So it's kind of fascinating. And two of the people that I know who do the most oil spill work have relied pretty exclusively on microbes. So not to say that we shouldn't be doing microbes and mycoremediation, but it's just something to consider. And again, how they can follow mycoremediation in a really powerful way. So that's a quick thing into microbes. I want to talk about plants really fast. Plants are sexy because people can see them. And they're pretty, like people see sunflowers and it gives them hope. And they think, oh, I can turn a contaminated land into something beautiful. And a lot of that is true. The interesting thing about plants and mushrooms and bacteria is that it's really hard to do phytoremediation if your soil is just a mess. If you have no soil biology, if the soil is destroyed, if there's no mycorrhiza in the soil, if there's just nothing, your plants can't really take root. You can't bring plants onto a destroyed landscape, put them in there and expect to get mad returns. And so there is this need with this work to kind of have, again, that multi-trophic idea of being like, if I'm trying to remediate, I have to also be bringing in some of this, like the compost and these other different pieces to do the work, right? Or I want to be inoculating my plants in some situations with mycorrhizal fungi because that's important. And that's also adding to this other aspect of remediation. So all of these things, it's like, again, you can't just be tunnel vision on it. This picture is just showing different plants that people use for phytoremediation. You have sunflowers. That's a picture from New Orleans after Katrina. The picture at the left bottom is brown mustard, which is a really well-known hyperaccumulator, one of those plants that kind of suck up contaminants. You also have at the top right-hand corner, one of my favorite plants, which is alpine pennycress. And it's one of my favorite plants because it is actually one of the best plants that they have found to hyperaccumulate lead. Lead is the big thing that people are often talking about because it's everywhere. Because again, as I was saying, lead paint, lead gasoline, all this stuff. And it's a big issue in a lot of communities and a big environmental justice issue as well. And has a lot of health impacts. And so people talk a lot about kind of like phytoremediation of lead. And whenever people talk about phytoremediation of lead, they want to talk about sunflowers because they look cool because they're big and they're yellow and exciting. But it's actually alpine pennycress, which is one of the best remediators and efficient remediators of lead. So that's just something to think about. And then you have things like willow at the bottom. So there's a lot of different plants that we could be talking about. The thing with phytoremediation to remember is that plants can only clean up as far as their roots can grow. So before I started doing research in bioremediation, I used to look at really sad old gas station sites. You would see like the fence and the old gas station. And I was like, oh man, I'm going to phytoremediate this. I want to do that so bad. But then I learned that most old gas stations have leaking underground storage tanks. And the acronym is LUST, like lust is in sexy times, but it's leaking underground storage tank, which is just terrible. And those tanks mean that you have a lot of your hydrocarbon contamination, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, all that very deep in the soil. And so you could plant all these beautiful sunflowers at the top of that, but if their soil, if their roots aren't getting down to the contamination, you're not actually doing the remediation. And the same would be true in kind of mycology, mycoremediation, anything. It's like it needs that contact to actually work. So you have to, when you're looking at this, you're dealing with a certain surface level of contamination and not necessarily deeper. Phytoremediation is good to low to moderate contamination. So again, if you're dealing with contaminants, it's so toxic that something can't grow there, you're gonna have to do things to modify that or kind of engage with other species or other kind of, we're looking at mushrooms, we're looking at microbes to moderate that environment before you can work with plants. But if it's low to moderate contamination, it might be fine. Another thing with plants is that people sometimes find plants in very toxic environments and then they assume that that plant is healing the landscape. And there's something where it's good to go on a site and see what's already there, see what local fungi, local plants, local microbes are present, because there might be actually species that have evolved in that site that are actually trying to heal the land because the land is brilliant and it's trying to kind of bring itself back. That's sometimes the case. Other times there's just some species who are very tolerant to that contaminant. So there's certain species that can tolerate, certain high metals, but they're not necessarily doing anything about it. right? And so just to not kind of get too delusional with that and be like, oh my God, I found this thing and it obviously does that thing. That's not always the case. Plants are also good. Bioremediation is also good because it can keep contaminants from moving off-site. And that is helpful if it's trying to keep things like from moving via erosion and things like that. And one of the biggest considerations with bioremediation is that when we're doing anything with heavy metals, the plants can become toxic waste themselves. And this is something that kind of people get really worked up about because we want these solutions that are perfect. We want to be able to say that we put a bunch of plants on heavy metals and then it turned it into sunflowers and rainbows, but that's not the case. It turns it into a heavy metal sunflower. And then you have to figure that out. And we're going to talk about that. But the point of that piece is that you can have a site that is all this contaminated soil. And if you're doing conventional remediation, which is what you see often like industry and government doing, what is the most kind of popular way to deal with that contaminated soil is to dig it all up and to then truck it and landfill it somewhere else, usually in a community that is poorer than you or a community of color, right? And so that isn't a very sustainable way to deal with contamination. And you're dealing with a huge volume of contaminated soil. And we don't have infinite levels of that in the world in terms of soil, right? And so one of the things that phytoremediation is really good at is doing remediation like on the site. And also instead of kind of taking up all those tons of contaminated soil, you're taking up these plants that are a much smaller volume. So even if you have to dispose of it in a landfill, it's a lot smaller in terms of just the amount that you're putting in. And so that's something to consider. Not a perfect solution, but it is better than, right? Now, this is just a little picture about how phytoremediation works and the different types of phytoremediation. So again, if you're looking at the root level of a plant, there's a lot of different things happening. There is the plant pulling up certain contaminants through its roots and kind of moving it into the plant, either sequestering it there, or again, like volatilizing it and kind of transpiring it and kind of moving it into the leaves and out. That's what you see often with chemicals, where it's kind of moving out of the tree. If it's metals, it can sequester in the tree, in the plant, in the stem, in the leaf, things like that. You also, at the root level, have a really interesting relationship with bacteria and fungi, where you see kind of breakdown happening at the root. And one of the interesting things, and we're going to see it in a second, is there's certain plants that they'll say are really good at breaking down hydrocarbons. And a lot of those plants that they talk about are nitrogen fixing plants. And it's not the plant necessarily, it's the nitrogen fixing bacteria that are good at breaking down the hydrocarbons in the soil, but they wouldn't necessarily be there if there wasn't that beautiful synergistic relationship with the plant. And so there's that combination approach that's happening in a lot of situations. So yeah, there's a bunch of different things happening there. Phytoextraction, phytodegradation, rhizodegradation at the root level, and then this volatilization of certain chemicals and stuff kind of coming out through the plant. When we're talking about phytoremediation, just a few things to consider in terms of steps. First thing you have to do, and this is the same with micro and myco, is you assess your site. What are you dealing with? And then based on what you're dealing with, either you've done your soil test, hopefully you've done your soil test, because then you know what's there and you know kind of the bench and the baseline for it. But you also know the history of the site and kind of have heard from people about maybe things that they've seen happen there. And then once you know what you're dealing with, you decide what plants you're going to work with based on which plants are good for what. And then in order to actually work with the plants, you have to prepare your site to work with those plants. And you also have to consider that some plants like shade, some like sun. Your site might kind of lean one way or the other, and then you got to be kind of creative like that. Then also, depending on what you're doing, whether you're dealing with chemicals or metals, if you're dealing with metals, you have to figure out how you're going to deal with the plants that are pulling up the metals, because now they have metals in them, and where are they going to go? And then you, again, find ways to test what you're doing to see if you're actually doing anything. Because again, you could plant a bunch of plants, they look amazing, and then you test the soil and they did nothing. Or you plant them and they actually start really pulling up what you're trying to pull up, and you don't have to do as many cycles of this as you thought you had to do. And so it's just this constant thing. And then it's just repeating it as long as you need to repeat it. And also applying things like compost and stuff over time to build up the soil and also kind of increase that ability to have that healthy soil food web and that microbial kind of immobilization of things. Now, this is a little table. And you guys get this presentation, so don't panic that there's a lot of stuff here. But these are just some examples of plants that have been peer-reviewed in science, Because you also see people say this plant does this, and then you try to research it and you're like, that was just a rumor or someone really liking that plant, versus actually looking into academic research and saying, these are the plants that have actually been studied to have marked differences at bringing down certain contaminants. So these are a few of those. If you look at hydrocarbons, again, you're seeing, there's some plants like poplar and stuff that are on there, but you're seeing things like alfalfa and ryegrass, clover. These are all plants that have, again, that bacterial, that kind of nitrogen fixer relationship, right? You're also seeing things like mulberry is actually good for hydrocarbon breakdown. And mulberry also has a relationship with a certain type of bacteria, and it's that bacteria that's doing that work. So that's just something to kind of consider. But these are different plants that have been found to break down different chemicals. TCE is something we see a lot around, dry cleaning places I never go because I never buy clothes that need to be dry cleaned. PCBs, we get into those persistent organic pollutants that mushrooms are kind of, I think, more the standard if you're dealing with those big chemicals and those really kind of complex ones. People tend to go a mycological approach, but you could do a mycological approach followed by a plant approach or a bit of both. There's a few different things there. Salt is on the list, and I don't think the things that are listed for salt there's a lot more things that should be there. This is just a few things because I didn't want to have I needed basically a table that fit. But salt is something, if you are in any area or you are passionate about fracking, oftentimes when people are dealing with land that's contaminated by fracking, it is land that has also had to deal with a lot of salt, right? Because a lot of the solution, the toxic solution that they use for fracking and the wastewater is very salty. And in places like North Dakota and the Bakken oil shale, and on indigenous lands up there, you'll have some of these frack operators taking this produced water, this contaminated water, and just letting it go in fields because no one's watching. And so you end up with a lot of salt contamination, which, along with other chemicals, which makes it very hard to do remediation because not a lot of plants want to grow in salt. So sometimes you actually have to look at how do you sweeten the soil, how do you deal with that before you can go to the next step. So lots of things there. I bet y'all didn't know that zucchini and pumpkin were so good for PCBs and DDT, but also makes you scared to eat them, right? So this is just things to consider. Now, this is something, I was teaching a class for this group of farmers who are kind of wanting to do more work on fire recovery. And what I found was, again, we talked about how some of these plants like alfalfa and rye and vetch and clover are good at breaking down certain chemicals because of the bacteria that they're working with and that kind of phyto-micro approach. And so it really kind of, if you're dealing with folks who have the ability to cover crop, maybe it's post-fire, they're worried about things like dioxin and stuff in their soil. The idea of cover cropping actually has this like underlying kind of passive remediation potential. I'm not saying for sure you have to test the soil to see if it's doing that. But if you are dealing with chemicals, we have a lot of these allies, and this is already something that people do that you can kind of play with. And another element where cover cropping and kind of working with some of these species that I already talked about, these nitrogen fixers, is additional, is vermiculture, right? So we get into worms. And we talked earlier about how using worm poo in compost tea brings in that bacteria Pseudomonas. But worms are also, the more we have cover cropping, the more we're working with certain plant species, we see doubling and tripling of worm populations. A study came out kind of showing that, and the worms not only are bringing that kind of microbial inoculation to the soil, they're also actively aerating the soil. And the more you aerate things, the more you give the potential for certain types of chemical breakdown, because that's important. And kind of, they're doing a whole bunch of things. They also tend to hyperaccumulate contaminants, which is not the best for their little bodies. But again, working with that kind of combination approach where your plants are also creating more in terms of a soil food web, or bringing back certain species that are really important to do other things, it just kind of all makes sense. Now, hyperaccumulators, we talked about this briefly. These are the plants that are good at pulling up contamination and extracting it from the soil. And it's kind of the most popular thing people tend to think of with phytoremediation. This is just another table of some of the plants that they talk about for this. And again, one thing I always say to people, if they're interested in phytoremediation, if you're in a certain area, like let's say you're looking at a certain ecozone or place in California, Google kind of native species and phytoremediation when you're looking at kind of different academic papers, because there's been a lot of research since I made this table, where they've looked at certain, local native species to be like, could this break this down? And there are papers that come out that say yes or no. And so if you're wanting to do this work and not necessarily introduce, non-native species, if you're trying to work kind of with what you got, kind of do that research to see, because this is not an exhaustive table at all. But you see here kind of the different plants that are potentially good at pulling up pulling up lead or pulling up arsenic or pulling up cadmium. One thing we see often on sites is you're not always lucky enough to have one type of contamination. Like if you have a site that just has lead, that's a lot easier than having a site that has lead and arsenic. But because of a lot of the contaminants, like old types of pesticides and different kind of multiple uses of sites, we often will have something like lead and arsenic or lead and cadmium on the same site. And they kind of will require different plants and also different amendments to work with them in a certain way. This is just kind of more things to kind of look at. Now, quickly on this, so when we're trying to extract heavy metals from the soil using plants, the acidity of the soil makes a very big difference in terms of how certain metals move. And so if you have really acidic soils or really alkaline soils, it'll make a difference in terms of whether things like lead and arsenic will be kind of pulled up into the plant or be kind of more immobilized in the soil. So cationic metals, which is things like lead and cadmium and copper and zinc, they are less mobile in more alkaline soils, more basic soils, and they become more mobile in acidic soils. So if you did a soil test and you found out that your soil is quite alkaline and you have a certain amount of lead, it's going to be hard for you to pull that lead up into plants because that lead is kind of stuck there more. It also means that it's not moving around as much, which is good, and you just have to find a way to deal with kind of the surface exposure. But in a situation like that, you might want to either find a way to immobilize the lead, or you would have to amend the soil to make it more acidic to actually facilitate the movement of it into your plants. If you had lead contaminated soil that was quite acidic, then it's like going to be a lot easier to do phyto extraction on that. However, if you had soil that had lead and arsenic is more soluble and more bioavailable in alkaline situations and is more immobilized in acidic situations. So you'd have to kind of play that and kind of do one and then the other and kind of move back and forth. And so that's just something to consider and to pay attention to your soil pH, because it does make a difference in this work. And you deciding, are you extracting? Are you immobilizing? Which one are you doing first? What amendments are you working with to kind of move that pH if you have to? Talked about this briefly. When you are dealing with extraction of contaminants into plants, and this is the same for mushrooms, if we're doing kind of myco extraction with heavy metals, you end up with the plant or the mushroom having the heavy metal in it. And then it's about what do you do with it, right? Because you cannot break down a heavy metal. There's stories of people growing plants on contaminated soil and then being really excited and then composting the plants and then spreading the compost on the garden because they think they did this beautiful alchemical thing. It's not, right? If you have a contaminated plant with heavy metals and you compost it, you make it smaller in volume, and you might also find a way to kind of further immobilize it in some ways, but you don't want to spread that on anything that you're going to be eating. So you have to think about where is it going to go. The standard is to bag it up and to send it to kind of toxic waste. And with that caveat of it's not perfect, but it's better than landfilling all the soil on the site. There are other folks who talk about incinerating it because they end up with a lot less contamination, but then you're putting air pollution into the air. There is some interesting work of people who are trying to extract the metal from the plant or the mushroom and almost looking at this phytomining or mycomining idea of, we have landfills full and kind of land full of metals because of what we've done to it. So instead of breaking up more mines to look for precious minerals and stuff, we could just be kind of harvesting our garbage in a certain way. But that is a very high-tech thing. It's a lot more high-tech, and it's not always at the disposal of kind of community folks. So I don't tend to see that as something that people are able to do just yet. The other way to deal with it is to kind of pick a spot on your site, mark it really well, separate it from everything else, put good signs up and kind of make that the toxic part of your site. And it's kind of like moving a problem that was everywhere into one place, composting it and kind of finding ways to try to immobilize it as much as possible, but just being really real about the fact that we can only export our pollution so much to other places, right? There is also the idea of vermicomposting and like breaking it down with worms and with compost, and then feeding that to things like trees and non-edible things on the site, where it'll get more bound up and kind of longer lived like woody material. But again, it's like there is no good answer for that in a way that makes people feel very comfortable. Now, another thing on plants, really quickly, phytofiltration. I mean, people know this is one of the oldest things there is in terms of what we've been talking about, but people using plants to help clean up water and to intercept water, looking at things like floating islands, constructed wetlands, and actually a really interesting thing about using plants to kind of be phytofilters and kind of pull up contamination is people, again, think it's the plant that's doing it, and there is phytoextraction. There is this kind of moving certain things into the plant material itself. But if you look at that picture on the right with that really big root mass on the bottom of a floating island, it's actually what happens in the water is this film of bacteria kind of covers that root mass called biofilm, and a lot of the remediation is happening within that biofilm and at that level. So again, it's a plant microbe kind of situation that's doing the work. Phytofiltration to me is a really interesting thing because there's a lot of things we can do with plants and mushrooms and microbes on the land to intercept, let's say, contaminated water from getting to a river, getting to a lake. But once it's in the lake or in the river, to me, phytofiltration starts to shine in terms of floating islands and things like that, where they're actually on the water. Because you can't really intercept it with certain things once you've got past a certain point. And we do have a lot of plant species that love water and grow well in water. So there's some really great examples of phytofiltration. If anybody looks up Tom Duncan and phytofiltration, he's a man who's done some really cool stuff and worked on some larger scale projects. So really cool things there. This thing is also something I was thinking about is we know, I mean, if people live in any of the West Coast cities, we see a lot of these, rain gardens and bioswales where they're trying to intercept kind of, storm water, storm runoff, and kind of use plants and stuff to clean it, as well as bacteria, right? Because there's a kind of a plant bacterial kind of remediation piece here. One thing I've not seen, and I haven't heard people incorporate with bioswales and with these kind of biofiltration pieces in the city, and we're seeing them happen kind of at, in some ways, fairly large scale in urban areas. In some places, I haven't seen people integrate mushrooms into that and integrate fungi. And you'll see sites where they're using wood chips and everything, but they're not thinking about fungi because it's some urban landscaping company or landscape architects that are scared of mushrooms, right? But if you look at these places and you realize that the whole point of this is to be able to hold more water and to also filter and purify water before it's kind of going out into rivers and streams and lakes, actually having myceliated wood chips and having incredible kind of mycelium in those places would help it retain more water, take more water up, and then also could be providing this extra remediation thing, and you would have this beautiful multi-trophic kind of approach to it. So I had to throw that in there. Now, do we have any questions before I go into scenarios? Preguntas? Questions? Okay. All right.
I do have a quick question.
Yes.
Sorry. When you talk about the phytofiltration of soils and stuff, so do you also recommend like adding a lot of plant matter, or are there certain, like, can you cover crop with plants that aren't going to maybe pull up the heavy metals, but that you could then, compost back into the earth? Because I see it like seems like a lot of removal and
it depends on what you're working with. So if you don't have a site where heavy metals is a big thing, then when I was talking about the cover crops, those plants were very much specific to chemicals. They actually had the more remediation capabilities around, let's say, hydrocarbons or dioxin or something like that. So that's when you'd be like, oh, I'm going to do like cover cropping with clover, right? Or something like that. If you were dealing with lead and you wanted to cover crop, I mean, you could, because it's like with lead particularly, you actually just want to reduce people's ability to get at the soil and get at the soil dust, because that's actually how it really moves around. It doesn't move into plants as easy as people think. It's more the soil that's getting on things and kind of people tracking it around and touching it and stuff. So kind of cover cropping and kind of creating that barrier and kind of holding it so it's running off less isn't a bad idea, but you wouldn't be working with the same plants I was talking about in terms of some of the ones that help with the breakdown of chemicals that you would for metals. So it would look different, right? And so it's only when we're looking at metals that we're talking about trying to pull things up. If you don't want to be removing a lot from your site. And that is a total decision. If you're like, I don't want to be creating all this toxic waste and having to take it out and stuff, then you tend to look more at ways to immobilize, which is not so much on the extraction and more working with, you know, microbes and certain plants that are kind of like going to more keep it in place, but they're going to like be like sucking it up, right? Or if they're sucking it up, they're sucking it up into longer term kind of structures that, you know, aren't really going anywhere. Does that make sense? The thing is, when we go through this so fast, it can all get a bit kind of mixed up. And so you always have to keep the chemicals and the metals kind of separate in your approach. And you can pick which one you want to deal with first, or if you have both, you know, but we'll talk a little bit more about it when we go through some of the scenarios, if that helps. Is it good? Awesome. Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question, Chanel.
Hello, Chanel.
Hello?
Hello?
Thank you very much for that talk and being very concise. I really understood what you were saying. But for the disposable, is there a way of freezing and also of like creating materials out of the things that are retracted? So kind of like, right, taking those heavy metals or those oils and chemicals and making them into something useful, like trapping them into something, right? That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ways like freezing or making into material.
So I haven't heard of people freezing it. Doesn't mean it isn't done. And I would say, look that up. I'm going to look it up after this talk because I've actually never thought about freezing something, even though I'm from Canada and that should be my normal. I haven't thought about that, but hey, I mean, potentiality there is. I mean, there are people who are either like, again, it's more of a chemical process or kind of a process via burning to extract it from the plant, because they can't do that. And I'll send you guys, if there's like a time after this, I was supposed to send you guys resources before this class and I was too busy, so my apologies, but I can send you an article actually about kind of some really interesting work that they were doing with plants that are like hyper nickel accumulators. And there's some plants where they can literally like cut the plant and like pull, like kind of take the sap out, and it's like it's being kind of concentrated in the sap. But it really depends on where the plant is holding the metal, right? There is a way, like if you take the plant and, I mean, it depends on what you're growing. When people tend to do phytoextraction, you're trying to grow plants that have like a lot of biomass. Like they got like a really kicking root system and a really big head of hair. That's kind of how it goes, right? And so you're trying to get a lot of foliage and a lot of roots, and kind of you're trying to, if you were to grow a tree, for example, that wouldn't be a good phyto extraction, because it's like you can't really remove it and it takes a long time to grow. But trees, for example, are really good in the sense that their roots can go really deep, and having more trees in your landscape mean that you almost have this built-in resilience for when there is deeper contamination. You have this being that can like pull it up in a way more powerful way and kind of do a lot more with it. But the problem is that it takes longer for it to get ready and to kind of get to that place. But there are people who have like, you know, planted certain plants that it kind of on the contaminated land, but they know it's a more like rot resistant, it's like a longer lived kind of tree species that you could use potential for furniture or things like that. But just being aware that if you're going to do something like that and you're trying to kind of either have it like live on this contaminated land or extract things and kind of be held in like a longer term way in kind of the woody material of the tree or the plant, it's nothing you want to make like baby toys out of. You know what I mean? Like you got to pick what you're going to make out of that thing as something that isn't kind of putting people at risk, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to see some of the creative kind of things around that and what could be done. Yeah. And also, I've never looked at this as like, you know, you get those things and like, again, you can compost down, like what can you do with that? And I haven't seen a lot of work on that, but it's something that it would be worth exploring and just trying to do a little bit of probing into, because things are changing all the time. Yeah. Thank you for that question though. It's really good. Anybody else? Okay, we're going to move into scenarios. So this is just like, I give a lot of information really quickly. And again, I really encourage people to kind of go read up more about microbes and about phyto in a way that's a lot slower. And that kind of gives you more of the nuances. as Maya said, like I wrote a book where I have like a whole chapter on microbes. I have a whole chapter on phyto that kind of lays it out a little bit more with a better sequence. And you can buy the book. If you can't afford to buy the book, if you search for it online, some dude literally copied every page online. So it's free. I didn't do it, but I'm super cool with it. So it's up to you. And some libraries have it, but it does actually go much deeper into both of those topics. And in not a very, like there's science behind it, but I don't tend to talk super academic because I don't like to read academic papers and I don't like to make anybody else do it. Question?
What's the name of the book?
It's called Earth Repair.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So for scenarios, we don't have a lot of time, but this is the stuff I find exciting. We just kind of talk through a few common things. And I've already hinted at a few of them. Like the first one I was going to talk about was lead because it's super, super common in our urban landscapes and also in rural landscapes. This is something that people sometimes think they're in a farmer's field and they're like, it's cool. Except that the pesticides that have been traditionally used going back a long time, like now the pesticides we're dealing with have a lot of chemicals and really kind of scary chemicals in them. In the past, they worked a lot with metals. So you would have like lead and arsenic and stuff in some of the pesticides of olden days. So you'll find this beautiful field in a rural area that isn't even a farm anymore, and you'll test the soil and it can be kind of, it might be dicey. Not always, but it's just something to think about. So we talked a bit about lead. I just wanted to break it down. When we are talking about lead, it is that decision you always have to make as a remediator, as whether you're going to try to extract the lead or immobilize the lead. And so the thing about lead, as I said, is a few things. Lead does not move easily into plants. When people talk about getting kind of lead contamination from like a garden, a lot of that lead contamination that they're getting isn't necessarily that it's in the plant that they're eating in terms of physically inside it. It's more it's on it. It's the lead dust from the soil kind of getting on the root of your, like getting on your potato, getting on your carrot. When it rains, that soil splashing up onto the leaves of your plant and that lead dust kind of being physically on it. People tracking with their shoes, kids playing in the dirt, kind of taking that soil into them and onto them. And that's where that kind of contamination can come from if you have kind of, you know, a longstanding kind of lead soil. So if you're trying to deal with lead, if you decide you want to extract it, which is what we talked about, that's that piece where you're thinking, okay, is the soil like, is it more acidic? Can I add certain amendments to kind of make it more acidic? And then I'm going to work with any one of those bioremediation species we talked about that are specific to pulling up lead. And I'm going to kind of, you know, plant them a bunch of times, pull them out when they're done, plant more in and kind of do it like that. And again, that species, the one I have on the left, that beautiful plant, Alpine pennycress, they found that out of all those species that are listed for lead, hyper kind of accumulation, that is actually one of the most efficient because lead moves very slow and it's kind of clunky. And so you can be moving it into sunflowers and spinach and stuff like that, but it will not kind of be pulling up maybe as much as you want as if you were working with something like Alpine pennycress. So just something to think about. That is a way to do it. And some people get really excited because again, this hyperaccumulation idea is sexy to people. However, sometimes the easier thing to do is to actually find a way to immobilize that. And so that is trying to find ways to add phosphorus to the soil in a big enough way. You know, in Oakland, the EPA was doing it with fish bones, ground up fish bones in lead contaminated soil because they were trying to create what we call lead pyromorphite, which is when you combine the phosphorus with the lead, it creates this more kind of stable form of lead that is like a lot less mobile than even normal. And so they were kind of doing that and then kind of covering the soil, you know, and that can be done. You can sheet mulch. You can just be like building up lots of compost. What you're trying to do is block people's ability to kind of get into the soil and for that soil to bounce up on things and to kind of move around. And so whether that's sheet mulch, whether that's mulch, you know, you could do mycelial mulch. I don't know, but there's lots of options there to try to kind of cover, immobilize, cover, and then kind of move on top of it. Whenever you're immobilizing, the thing about immobilizing is that you have this situation that you've moderated, but you have to keep an eye on it because things change, right? And when you extract, it's like you're kind of getting rid of it. So people kind of like that. And there's also nothing stopping you from doing a bunch of extraction to lower levels and then to immobilize and to cover. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. So different ways to look at it. And sometimes people do a combination on a site because they do plants in a certain place. So people are like, oh, look at that happening. It's more of an educational moment, but they cover up the rest. And if you are doing a phytoremediation on site, you do want to find a way to, even as you're doing that phytoremediation, try to cover up that soil as much as you can. Because again, if that's the primary kind of vector for people kind of taking in the contamination, them touching, kids playing, pets moving through that site, you want to try to make it so that they're not. So maybe you're planting those plants and then you're wood chipping around it so that people can't get at the soil, whatever that is. And again, I haven't seen people do a lot with myco kind of extraction with lead, or even kind of adding in like myceliated wood chips, but it's something that I can see being helpful. And it would be this like added thing you could do. Wildfire. So this is something I have a growing passion with. Anybody who's on this from the Pacific Northwest, especially California. This is kind of one of those climate intensified realities that people are really seeing. And it's something that in the last little while, there's been a bunch of fires that have rolled through certain communities where there have been kind of this thought of either like remediation or restoration in the aftermath. The biggest reason why remediation and wildfire is a thing is because we have a lot of contamination that happens post-fire because of what we build our houses with, what we build our cities and our towns with, right? And so what we're especially looking at, so if you have a fire burn in a forest and it doesn't really kind of, it's just trees burning and landscape burning, there is going to be some things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from like wood burning down, but we're not dealing with the kind of contamination that we're concerned about in the same way, in any way, shape, or form, as if we're having a fire roll through, a place like Santa Rosa or Paradise or, whatever town. I'm from Alberta, Canada, and Fort McMurray, our big kind of oil town, burnt at one point. Like when you have houses that are built with PVC, with, like toxic carpets, all these different things, people's household cleaners, their garages, their cars, transformer poles, all these things burning and kind of becoming ash, you end up with this really hyper concentrated kind of spread of contaminants. And it's a soup, like it's a lot of different things. So we are always looking at the toxic ash and the debris that's left by a fire when it's a structural situation, which means it's kind of like in that urban interface and it's actually burning down a structure. And the contaminants people have to watch for, and they found from studying the soil, you see certain heavy metals in very high levels post-fire. You see certain things like lead, arsenic, antimony, all the things, because anything that was alive in a structure that burned, that metal is still there, right? And now it's more mobile. Before, when it was in an object, you couldn't really kind of move it around the same way, but now that it's ash or it's debris, it's kind of more able to be kind of run off via heavy rains into streams or via landslides or via the wind. Another thing we see dioxin is that when you have plastics and certain things burn, you actually create dioxin, which is one of those call it persistent organic pollutants, a POP. So it's very long-lived. It's a cancer causer. It's a bunch of different things. We end up with things like dioxin post-fire. We end up with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs. And what you also get is kind of very caustic. Like the ash is actually quite high pH and quite caustic. So again, a lot of that, if we have, let's say, a fire, and then you get some big rains that always happen after the fire, not during, you have that water kind of moving into our streams and rivers. You're not only getting a big kick of this toxicity, you're getting also a kind of a alkaline kind of thing hitting water. And if you have certain species in there, it can be pretty damaging. So certain to think about. You also have, in the aftermath of a fire, if it goes through a town or a city, usually folks like FEMA are supposed to come and do debris removal and do ash removal. They like that happens. There's situations where that might not happen if you're kind of like not like you're more off the grid, or I'm not sure, but I know that they did that in Paradise and in other places. So they removed most of this. But the thing is again, between the time that this happens and they get to cleaning up everything, there might be a landslide, there might be rain and other things that move this around outside of the zone that's going to be cleaned up. So that's something to consider. And even if they clean everything up, there's still residual, there might still be some left, because people tend to clean up to a certain standard and it might not necessarily be the standard that everyone is down for. So there is a potentiality to do remediation post-fire, as well as restoration, because I know you guys heard a little bit about some micro restoration things you could do with it, but I just wanted to kind of flag that. And in any kind of remediation setting, you want to know what you're dealing with. You might not be dealing with all of these contaminants, but you might be dealing with a few, and then you can kind of pick the way you want to go. Another thing people don't think about in fires is fire retardant. And it's something that is people, whenever there's going to be fires, you're going to have like firefighters like dumping this in big ways because it's part of trying to limit the spread of the fire. Fire retardants have pretty much like fertilizer in it. It's cool if you kind of Google it, look it up. And they do have some kind of unknown chemicals that people don't talk about. But the main thing is you have high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, they are not supposed to do this near streams, but when it's like a full-blown fire, it's like things sometimes go where they're not supposed to go in terms of the dumping and everything. And it's something to consider. And Forest Service folks have actually kind of sounded the alarm on some of the impacts of major fire retardant getting into creeks and rivers, especially for salmonid species, right? So an interesting thing I noticed about this, because no one's talking about it, is that when we have high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus that are running into our water, we do get those things like algal blooms, right? And we get that kind of like too much algae, it kind of blankets out the oxygen, and you deal with these kind of really hard situations in the rivers and the lakes for fish. And so there is interesting ways, like we talked about, with phytofiltration and things like that to potentially help with that and to kind of lessen the load with the toxicity of that hyper amount of fire retardant. And it's just something to pay attention to. It's not always like that, but that is something that can be an issue for the environment. Now, bioremediation considerations. I mentioned this, it's like the first thing is like that removal of toxic ash and visible debris. That shouldn't be you doing it. That should be FEMA or a certain contractor that they're bringing in to do it. But on the off chance that they don't come, it's like people need to potentially, that's the first step. You can't really do any of your bioremediation installations in that. You have to kind of get that away or find ways to kind of concentrate it and then to work with it. And you have to have protective gear to do that work because you're dealing with contaminants. Then you have to kind of determine where the contamination is, or if there's certain hot spots, or if there's ways where that contamination is moving into places you're trying to protect. So a really good example of this is in Sonoma County. After the Tubbs fire a couple years ago, Sonoma County, if anyone's from Sonoma County, there is just a huge amount of really hip people in that county who have really amazing permaculture skills, mycology skills, all that stuff. It's like a very earthy place. And when they had a fire happen in Santa Rosa, there was a lot of concern over all that toxic ash like ending up in the creeks and in the rivers and hurting the fish and things like that. And so there was this really interesting organizing effort for a bioremediation response. And it's the only one that I've seen post-fire. And what they did is they ended up taking straw wattles. You can see in that picture, that's the example of a straw wattle on the top, and kind of inoculating that in certain cases with oyster mushrooms. They tried a bunch of different things. And then they took those kind of inoculated wattles and kind of tried to put them in the path of where they kind of, the most strategic path of where they saw like there was going to be kind of like that runoff that would potentially go into the watershed. And so it was a really interesting effort, and a lot of people kind of mobilized to do it and really pulled on different relationships with different mushroom farms and compost kind of people and all that different stuff. But one interesting thing about this effort is they're not sure if it worked because they didn't have a chance to test things before. So there was like, did it work? Did it not work? People don't know. But they also didn't necessarily have this stuff ready to go, right? It's really easy. Straw wattles are used often post-fire to deal with erosion. When you burn all the things on top of land, then it kind of, soil can just kind of run, right? And so they'll use straw wattles to kind of help catch that soil, keep it from going into the water and everything. If you myceliate that straw and create a mycofilter, that's a whole other animal. But everybody knows that you can't just stick a bunch of mycelium in that straw wattle and then put it up there and it's doing the filtration job. You either need to give it time to do that, or you need to have it ready to go, which means that kind of going back to that idea of pre-positioning your resources, going into fire season, having certain people make this and have a lot of these on hand, and understanding that if it happens in a community, you might be able to actually gift these and help install them because they're ready to go. And you're not waiting that extra, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, to get it ready to that actual place where it can do its job most efficiently. So that's something to just think about. So just that covers most of it, making the installation. That multi-kingdom approach with Sonoma County, there was that big attention on the mycofiltration piece. in the aftermath, and that's very specific to me in terms of runoff and water and interception. Again, if we're thinking about the fire returns, if we're thinking about things that have already gotten into the rivers and lakes, maybe then we also start adding in our floating islands. Maybe we are building up certain things in the riparian zone to kind of like, again, plants to intercept. If we're looking at the town and people wanting to maybe at some point in the next few years do a community garden, then we're moving into whatever plant, mushroom, or microbe strategy to heal the soil. That even if, you know, a lot of the contaminants already got removed by the debris removal, there's still some left. And on top of that, that soil just got its ass kicked really hard by heat, by contaminants, by everything. And so what can we do to kind of bring it back and bring back that vitality? And that to me is working a lot more with, again, like a different way of working with plants and microbes and fungi. So just kind of thinking about all that different thing. Testing and monitoring is a big thing. People talk about, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Testing and monitoring, it just allows you to know whether you did it or not. Because there is a certain thing with bioremediation where people just think if they do it, it works. And sometimes that is absolutely the case. I've seen people do it and they were shocked by the results. And then I've seen people do it and the land is not responding that way. And, you know, if you're trying to tell people that something is safe when it's not, you need to know. That's something you actually need to know. So I really wish, when I think about California, I think about British Columbia, which is where I actually spent a lot of time living. I really wish people would kind of gear up and organize for this, build the relationships with the people who have huge amounts of compost, people who have like mushroom farms, like have all those things ready, create some of these like microfilters and stuff ahead of fire season, and kind of be ready to do certain things, you know, to understand where things already are kind of your kind of choke points and your important points in the watershed, all of that, because I think it's really important to being able to respond if you want to respond and when you want to respond. And actually another interesting thing about Sonoma County is you can't always do this. If you are in a place where you're trying to do anything where you're getting close to kind of water, and you're getting in the water, and it's on public lands or whatever, you run into a lot of trouble with the government because you need to get permits and approvals and whatever. And they're not always hip on certain kinds of bioremediation, or they're not always wanting regular kind of people to do it because of liability and things like that. And during a disaster is not necessarily always the time to try to push that relationship because they're freaking out about 1,000 different things. I work in emergency management right now, and it's like you don't pressure the responders and kind of these government folks who are burning out because of their responsibilities in the moment. If you have a chance to kind of build up those relationships ahead of time, to sit down and talk to some of these people who might be allies in the system, who might be able to kind of like give you access or look the other way, you do that ahead of time. You get them stoked on your ideas ahead of time. There is a chance though also in disaster where people are kind of, they don't know what to do. And then you can say, hey, I have this idea, here it is. And we bring it all together and we got everything for you, just let us do it. That's totally possible, but it's always better if you've already built a relationship. And to me, Sonoma County was able to do this because they have hip people in government and there is already a very strong earth consciousness there. So people were open to the idea. That's not every place, right? So it's just important to think about that and to kind of do the pre-work if you have to. Now, oil spills, we talked about it a few times. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna do it really fast. This is one where it's big and not a lot of people can kind of hit it at that big level. But if you're dealing with a community that has been impacted by an oil spill, a few things that are important is, you know, you wanna scale up, you wanna have, again, like the fire, having certain materials already ready to go is really important. There's a difference between an active oil spill and something like what Amy Sacha was dealing with, which is like long-standing oil contamination. That's a lot easier to kind of get in and work with than something that's an actual hot situation. You need to have the right safety gear to protect yourself. One of the biggest ways we can help impact communities or your community if there's an oil spill is to be really pushing for certain considerations around the environment and health. In my book, and if anybody wants this, I'll just send them the chapter. I do a whole chapter on understanding how industry cleans up oil spills and how government does, and how there's certain ways that they do it that make it worse or that actually can bring in certain toxic impacts to people. We hear a lot about this if you know about dispersants and the BP spill. There's things like that, that if you see the government getting ready to do that, educating the community, sounding the alarm, organizing is really important because it can make a bad situation a lot worse. Making sure that if you see workers who are working on the site, if they're not wearing respirators and the right kind of equipment, they're putting their health at risk. And consistently in these disasters, especially oil spills, government and industry will downplay the risks and not want people to be wearing the respirators because it makes it look more toxic than they want it to look. And so there's a lot of needs for people who are in the know to actually bring that up and to make sure that people know that they need to be wearing certain gear. They might want to consider evacuating in the first 12 hours because that's when all the major in a kind of certain kind of oil spill, you have like the volatilization of some of these chemicals like benzene that are a lot more active in the first few days, getting people out of there if you can, right? These are all things that you can advocate for. And you can also advocate for bioremediation and things like that. And so that's a really important place. And then if you kind of have the opportunity to go beyond that, you know, trying to find ways to, again, intercept the oil from kind of moving inland to kind of going down certain places, using things, we talk about natural booms and sorbents, you know, microfilters, all these different things are things you can kind of play with. But again, we're talking at a certain scale and it really depends on where you are. And then there is the ability to kind of then treat it using microbes, using plants, using mycology to do it. And there are folks who have done this. You guys heard from Mia Rose Maltz. She did a really cool kind of project a bunch of years ago when there was a spill in the Bay Area. And they were using hair mats, felted hair mats to kind of pick up oil from this kind of coming in from the beach and from the water. And then they were breaking it down kind of off site with mycelium. And they actually found that it worked to a certain degree, but that mycelium doesn't like hair. A lot of oil spill kind of natural sorbents, people love to use like hair sausages or hair mats. And that's something where the mushrooms at a certain point are like, we don't necessarily want to work with the hair. And then so she then started working with bacteria and found that there was this like added breakdown. So this has been done in small ways. Again, more you see people taking like oil, contaminated soil and doing kind of the microbe breakdown and other things like that. But it's just like a quick something to think about. I mentioned natural sorbents and booms. Again, we're coming to the end of our time, so I hate to rush it, but I'm gonna have to. But the whole thing about a boom in oil is that you're trying to basically keep the oil from moving in. So you'll have like kind of, in conventional remediation, they have it on water. It's usually plastic. It's these like kind of long sausage-like things with a certain kind of thing that hangs below the water and above, and to kind of corral the oil. It can also be on land to kind of keep it from moving in. It's kind of blocking it and maybe absorbing it as well in certain situations. But if you are working with things like, you can use straw as a bit of a barrier to kind of like sop up the oil, and then you can, via MycoRenewal and microbial remediation, you can break it down, right? Same thing, the hair mat picture is in the right top. Below it is, during the BP Gulf spill, people got really excited about filling like giant socks full of human hair. And they were going to use that to, again, sop up the oil and then do this kind of in situ breakdown somewhere else using bioremediation. That's all potential. Things like coconut coir and cattails are really good at kind of like absorbing it and then again, taking it and treating it somewhere else. But these are, it's more like I'm telling you this, like this is what's potential versus it's not always easy to do because you're going to really interact with government and stuff where they don't necessarily want you there. And then you really have to think about protection and how you're going to treat this, but it is something to think about and something to play with. Yeah, I'll kind of cut it off there because we don't have time. Finally, I just wanted to say that if you're doing this work, you got to take care of yourself. Y'all are probably pretty hip on how mushrooms are good for healing the body. And what's really interesting is some of these plant and mushroom allies that we work with are really good at not only healing the land, but healing some of the things that people get from dealing with contaminated land. I always tell folks, if you are doing remediation work, like whether if it's lead, you have to be kind of like, you know, wearing like an N95 or something, because you're not wanting to breathe in the lead dust, right? You're not wanting to kind of do a bunch of garden work in your clothes and then go hug your kid in your lead shirt. Like these are things you have to think about. If you're dealing with more of a chemical or an oil spill situation, you have to wear a respirator because you don't want to be breathing that in, because there's consequences to your life over time and over exposure. Same thing with wildfires, like being in those places where you have a lot of the metals and the chemicals and the ash, you have to be wearing kind of the right kind of protection. But even then, you can support your body with things like medicinal mushrooms, like reishi mushroom, like shiitake, that are really good for helping, again, like prevent things like cancers, helping decrease hypersensitivity to chemicals. Lion's mane, really good for central nervous system, right? And a bunch of other pieces. certain plants like cilantro are really good for pulling heavy metals out of your body. You have to combine it with drinking a lot of water and eating a lot of fiber so you can literally get them out of you, but that can be really helpful. Working with plants like milk thistle or dandelion or burdock to support your liver if you're doing any kind of work with contamination, because your liver is kind of where it goes to, and it really helps your body kind of handle contamination. So you really want to support it, right? There's a lot of different things there. But to kind of think about that, and even in your work, kind of bring those resources into the communities that you're working in. You see a lot in the fire situations in California. There's been some really incredible herbalists who've kind of stepped forward and shared like what people can do to kind of help kind of, you know, deal with like what they're breathing in and what they're experiencing. Stress is a big part of it too, and people finding ways to kind of be calm in kind of contamination and everything that's going with that. And being a resource on that, or sharing those resources, or making that medicine for other people is a really beautiful act as well. So I just want to kind of leave it there. We got like 9 minutes for questions. If you guys have any additional questions that we can't answer here, my email is below. Just so you know, it's yahoo.ca, because I'm old as fuck, and that's from Canada. .com is American, .ca is Canadian. People always fuck this up. My website is Earth Repair. And if you go there, there's some really neat resources. Like I have a whole kind of write-up on bioremediation, environmental justice. I have a really interesting article that I just did last year that was kind of highlighting and elevating certain women who are doing amazing bioremediation work. And then also for the different scenarios, I talk about different things. I have a whole section on contaminants that you can read about different contaminants. So I try to put a lot of resources on there. But if there's something that isn't on there, you can always reach out and ask me, and I'll try to respond in a timely way. So that's it. Any questions? Snappity snap from Taylor, right on. Yeah. Questions? You got 9 minutes, so you better ask fast.
I have a question.
Chanel?
About anyway, yes. Hello.
Yeah, I got you.
Of anyways that you test the soil, because I know you said you don't like doing a lot of academic or a lot of conventional ways. So what are ways that you test the soil that are like DIY, or that you can use the resources like around you?
Yeah, I think there is a need to do things in an academic way sometimes. I just, myself personally, I just can't read some of the shit that people write because there's no feeling in it. So I struggle. But I think, so when it comes to testing soil, I think actually testing the soil isn't that hard. Like in the sense that you work with, you go to either a lab or to a university. I think in California, and certain places in the States, there's agriculture extension offices that'll do certain testing for you for cheap or for free, especially around things like lead. That's something we don't have in Canada. So it's actually a really cool resource in the States. And I think that there might be people, I don't know if Maya or I think Ellen might know a bit about this, but it's basically like, they usually give you like what you're supposed to kind of put the soil in, and you kind of take it from different parts of your site and then send it into the lab. And actually an interesting thing is that there is some interesting DIY stuff. I haven't paid attention to it in the last couple of years. If you can reach out, I think Danielle Stevenson, she knows a little bit more about that, because I think she's been doing some work on that and actually got into some of the DIY pieces of it. So if you have her contact from the last presentation, I would ask her that question. But there is some interesting, there are some DIY tests, but usually to me, it's a piece of, if you can afford it, like a soil test is expensive. It's not that expensive unless you're doing a lot of them. And there's different ways to do it, where you either take several samples from different parts of your site and send them all in separately, because you're trying to figure out what parts of your site have contamination. Because if you just take a sample in the left corner, but all your contamination was over by the right because some shack burned down on the right, you're going to say, oh, my site's clean, but you didn't test the whole thing, so you don't actually know. So there's like that way of being like, if I test in all these different places, I can actually sometimes locate if there's a hot spot, but that can be more expensive because you're kind of sending in multiple tests, versus if you take multiple kind of bits of soil from your site, mix it all up in a container, and then kind of send the one in, you're getting a composite sample that tells you like, kind of, is there contamination on your site? But then you end up not knowing where, right? So there's kind of different ways of doing it. But the biggest thing I would say with soil testing is when you get your resource, like, if you send it in, whether it's to, you're kind of paired up with the university, and this is something where I would say, if you're doing this work and you can partner with a lab or with the university where they're either offering this stuff for free, and they're also hopefully offering their expertise to read it to you and give you the results, because people will sometimes go and get soil results. They'll get a piece of paper that comes back in the mail that says, you have this much of this and this much of that. It's really important that you understand, when you ask them to do the test, don't just say, hey, can you test my soil? Because if you do that, you're gonna get like one of those like generic garden tests where they tell you what nutrients are in your soil. You have to say, I want you to test for the following heavy metals and the following chemicals to get the right kind of soil test, right? And then when you get it back, you need to understand what the numbers mean and if this means it's or not. And so that is something that, again, you can usually like partner with someone to figure out, or you can just kind of like try to read through some of that kind of guidance around soil testing and kind of self-learn. It's not that hard, but it is like, can be a bit technical sometimes. So a few different ways to think about it. I know the first time I did a soil test, I was doing this really cool kind of communal herbal garden that we did in Victoria, BC, that we kind of did in the back of a school area, that we were like, oh, we're like making this beautiful thing. And we tested the soil before we were gonna kind of do this herbal garden that was gonna be like a people's apothecary. We got the results back and we didn't realize that we hadn't asked, like we'd sent a test, but we didn't say check for metals. So we got the test back and there was no kind of sign of them. And we thought we're good. But it's because we didn't ask for that test. We just got a generic kind of nutrient thing. So I don't know if we were good, right? So you just got to be really careful what you're asking for and be really clear about it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I've heard about using like seed germination as a way to test soil for toxicity, kind of general toxicity. Has that been used for looking at heavy metal toxicity?
I believe so, yes. So that's like, when you're doing kind of the seed germination, it's the bioassay. That's what it's called, the bioassay. And I mean, it can be used to kind of be like, is there like, you'll see like some things are growing better than others, right? And that can kind of tell you, it won't tell you numbers, but it'll give you like a kind of an idea of what's there in terms of, is it contaminated, is it not? I haven't done bioassays. I know Mia Rose-Maltz did it, and I think a few other people have done it kind of looking at contamination in different projects. So you can do it. I would still lean to doing a soil test. If you can afford a soil test, if you can get the funding, or if you can partner with, a university or a lab. I have a really cool remediation mentor and friend out in Chicago, Nance Clem. If you ever want to look her up, she has a really cool website and kind of does really neat things. She ended up kind of partnering with a lab and they give her pretty much free testing, right? So that's like, if you can find those hookups, that'll be a lot kind of like sharper than kind of doing a bioassay. Bioassay, I think, people were doing also if you're in a place where you don't have access to labs, or it's going to be very cost prohibitive to do that, then that's a way of kind of getting an idea of like where things are at, right? And to what extent of contamination you have. It's not going to tell you what you have, but it'll tell you the severity maybe. Also, you have a cute cat. I can see your cat. Very cute. Anybody else?
Can I say something?
Yes, sir.
I wanted to thank you, Leila, for bringing that bridge into the course around bioremediation work and the lens of anti-colonial struggle, and how a lot of this work is rooted in land and the relationship to the land that we're all working to, in a sense, heal and bioremediate. But yeah, I just want to shout you out for bringing that in. It was a refreshing and very inspiring change of pace for me for the last few weeks of the readings, and just reading about some of the projects that are already happening, not just here but cross borders, and understanding that this approach to some of this work is very multi-layered, and actually being able to stand up and call it and name it anti-colonial, and accepting that we're dealing with a legacy of settler colonialism and currently still fighting a very a very harsh and powerful white supremacist situation here in not only in the United States but in Canada and all these places that are falsely named. I just want to shout that out and honor you and the whole course for bringing that in, because for me, I'm not really like a scientist, and I didn't go to school in that way, but I came to this work because I understood that some of this is very much intertwined, like the mycelium underground. And so yeah, I just want to say gracias and shout outs to you, and keep the power moving.
Thank you. Gracias a ti también. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I think that's our time. I appreciate all y'all tuning in and also wanting to learn this stuff. And I'm excited wherever you go after this course and whatever you do, feel free to reach out. I always tell people, if you end up working on a project and you want advice or you want to just bounce some ideas off, hit me up. I'm sometimes busy and I don't always get back to people, but I do try. So I look forward to kind of connecting in the future. I don't know if Maya's still on there. Is Maya
I'm still here. My
Okay.
internet cut out for a little while, but I'm
Oh,
back.
that's cool. Do you want to close it out, babe?
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Lila. That was an incredible presentation. And I'm really excited to be with you all next week. We're going to be talking about social mycology and mycopsychology with me. Lila, did you want to send me some articles? I can include those in the next week's homework. So I might not send out the homework till tomorrow morning. I don't know if anybody's chomping at the bit for that, but it might take me a while to compile whatever Lila sends me and send it out. So
Sure, yeah. Sounds
great.
good.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening or day, depending on what time zone you're in.
Ciao.
Ciao.